Let's talk about our division of estate spreadsheet template. So we have a template in here just to remind you of some things you'll want to consider when you're preparing a spreadsheet of a proposed division of the estate. And there's various reasons you might put this together. One is you just trying to settle your case. So whether you're sending a settlement offer just from lawyer to lawyer or you're going to mediation, it will help you to put together a spreadsheet of a division of the assets and debts. And if you're going to trial, it will help you to present to the court your proposed division of the assets and debts. So it's an easy way to look at the whole estate in one swoop. So I always do these on cases. And we have an example of a spreadsheet attached in the document section to Smart Legal Practice, so you can see what we're talking about. But when considering putting yours together, we have some tips here in the template. One is consider the tax effect of the various assets. Now what we mean by that is obviously $1 in a 401k is different than a cash dollar in a checking account because the dollar in the 401k has not been taxed yet. So if it were me, I'd rather have the cash dollar. But sometimes this needs to be thought about, and you might even tax affect your spreadsheet, and sometimes not. So for example, let's say you're going to divide pre-tax dollars fairly evenly, which is generally retirement dollars. IRAs, not Roth IRAs, because those have already been taxed, but traditional IRAs, 401ks, things of that nature. If you divide those fairly equally, and then you divide cash, what I would consider cash, or post-tax investments fairly equally, then you really don't have to tax affect because it's already being considered, right? We're both getting some pre-tax equally and some post-tax. But let's say you really don't have that option because the main assets are a house and a 401k, and that's not unusual. So there's a bunch of equity in the house and they're going to offset it with the 401k. Well, the house is more like a cash dollar. There may be a little bit of capital gains tax, but it's not going to be at the same level of the 401k. So in that instance, you might want to tax affect. Now, we say that like it's easy. It isn't easy because you have to make some assumptions. You don't know what tax level the person's going to be taxed at when they withdraw the 401k funds, right? And the reason that we put the money in pre-tax is we're hoping and assuming that we're not going to need to draw on that money until later in our lives when we've retired, and our tax level would be much lower than it is during our prime earning years, right? That's the hope, but it doesn't always happen that way. So especially at divorce, sometimes people have to go into their 401k money because they need money now. Maybe that's how they're going to purchase their house. So you have to consider what you know factually about the case. Are they going to, do they know now they're withdrawing money out of that 401k? And if they do it exactly right, pursuant to the divorce, they can avoid the penalty in certain circumstances. So important note. But they're still going to pay the tax at their current tax rate. So if you knew that, that would be easier, right? You know their current tax rate. But if you don't expect the person to withdraw it for a long time, or it's unforeseen when they will withdraw it, then you have to make some assumptions about what that tax rate would be. And you can hire a professional. There's some really good financial professionals out there to help who can do tax affecting for you if it's more complicated or if more assumptions are going to have to be made. And then you should reveal to everyone involved what assumptions you made. Okay, next tip for your spreadsheet on the template is use the net number for each asset. And what I mean by that is when you are entering the house as a great example, because that's a common asset in most of our cases, you want to do the fair market value minus the mortgage, as opposed to putting the fair market value on one line and the mortgage on a separate debt line. And the reason that we do this, that we put the net number for the house all in one line, and you can kind of show your math in the description line, the reason we do this is there's not going to be an instance, I shouldn't say never say never, right? It would be very unusual for one party to take the mortgage and the other party to take the house. So usually that debt is going to run with that asset. And so it's easier just to put it all on one line and put the net number. And then once you're doing your proposed division on your spreadsheet, you would be awarding that to one person. And we do the same thing with cars. So anything that has a debt like that, real estate typically, or cars, boats, airplanes. I don't have any cases with airplanes, but if you did have one with an airplane, you would want to put that net number. And that's how most lawyers in the legal community think about it. So that's one reason to do that net value. You'll want to remember, and this is a reminder in your template, to include in your spreadsheet reimbursement claims and tort claims. So that's not as obvious because you're not thinking of it as an asset or a debt, but you do want it to be considered in your division, and the reimbursement claim could be what I call below the line. So you're going to have in your spreadsheet the listing of all the assets, all the debts, and then you're going to have a proposed division, and you're going to kind of have a bottom line of this is how much is in the estate, this is how much is going to husband, this is how much is going to wife. Below that line is where your reimbursement claim would be, depending on the claim. But in many instances, it would be below the line. So let's say that you are making a claim against the community estate back to husband's separate estate. So let's say husband had taken separate property money and he had loaned it to the community or invested it in the community or spent it on the community, and he has an equitable claim to get some of that back. Below the line, you would say, okay, out of this estate, I need this much to go back to husband's separate property. If you do it above the line, you're kind of taking his own money and paying him back. So you want to think about where the placement of that reimbursement claim is. And if you have a tort claim, which is unusual, because now under the family code, often you don't get to have both a tort claim and a disproportionate division. So we've kind of seen less tort claims. But if you did have a tort claim for some reason, you would include that on there as well, because you certainly want in the total picture of money to be divided or awarded or ordered for that to be a consideration. One thing to remember that is sometimes overlooked is incurred but unpaid bonuses. So for example, let's say that it's very common for businesses to pay a bonus in the first quarter for last year's performance. So let's say your parties are getting divorced, and let's say they're getting divorced in early 2013. Well, one of the parties may have a bonus they've earned during the marriage all through 2012, but it just hasn't been paid yet because it's going to be paid in March or April after the first quarter, where the company's had time to assess, how they do last year, did you meet your goals, blah, 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 and now they're going to get that money, but it hasn't been paid. So it is a community asset. It was incurred while the community estate was still rocking along. It just hasn't been paid yet. So I just have that as a standard line on your spreadsheet to remind you to ask and inquire, does somebody have a bonus coming up that your client might have a right to a portion of? Okay, this is just a tip that'll help you once you're drafting eventually, and it also might help you as you're dividing things or putting together your proposed division of assets and debts. When you're building the spreadsheet, or whoever in your office is, if they will include on the description line whose name each asset is in, that would help you, because as your starting point, you're typically going to try to put things in the party's category that's in their name already, so we're not having to divide everything and realign everything. So for example, if they both had a traditional IRA, your starting point would probably be, okay, let's give husband the IRA in his name and wife the IRA in her name. And then if it doesn't work out to whatever percentage you're going for, you can always find an offsetting account. But it would be helpful when you build it, if you build it and state whose name everything's in. You'll be ahead. And we do note here that there's an example of a spreadsheet in our documents. So those are just some tips to think about when you're putting together your spreadsheet that I think will be useful for you.